When extracting data from pivot tables, GetPivotData formulas can be long and difficult to read. By default, GetPivotData is not dynamic, which makes it sometimes annoying. For example, the value of current assets is equal to this, and when I copy down, it remains locked to current assets as an absolute reference. An easy way to get around this is to uncheck GetPivotData in the Analyze tab. And now when I link to the pivot table, it returns a relative cell reference. However, when fields are moved around, these cells will return incorrect results. So a better approach would be to make GetPivotData dynamic. So in this tutorial, you'll learn how to edit GetPivotData and create a dynamic report from a regular pivot table, a pivot table loaded directly from Power Query, a pivot table from the data model, and a pivot table converted to cube formulas. Let's get started. You can download the file and follow along. Please subscribe if you haven't, and don't forget to click the like button. Thank you. This is a trial balance, a list of closing balances for 2021 and 2022 over a 6-month period. The goal is to calculate the movement in assets and liabilities over both periods. I'll go ahead and insert a pivot table. Shortcut Alt-NVT. Place on the new worksheet. Move accounts to rows and balance to values area. Right-click, number format, number, check 1000 separator and no decimals. Now the current assets balance is equal to this. Press F2 to review the argument. First argument is the data field, which is the balance. Second argument is the pivot table, which is in cell A3. And the third argument is a pair containing the field and item, account and current asset. An alternative is to use Shift and F3 to review the argument, if you prefer that method. Escape. To make this formula return the balance for the account selected, all you have to do is replace the hard-coded name with the cell reference, and that's it. It is now a relative cell reference. If you have multiple fields in the pivot table, it works the same way. Simply replace the hard-coded name with the cell reference. Copy down. Now let's build the report. Move date to columns. Depending on your version, Excel will group the dates automatically, but you can press Ctrl Z to undo. I'll right-click on the date and group into years and months. Okay, now move title to rows so the accounts are in their respective categories. Move equity below long-term liabilities. Now I'll create a drop-down list for the month. Copy the title and account. Add totals and format. Good. Current year is 2022. Last year is 2021, and this column is for the change. Good. Now to extract the balance of current assets for the month of January, I'll make this cell equal to January 2022 in the pivot table. Cool. Press F2 for edit mode. As I explained earlier, replace the hard-coded fields with the cell reference, okay? Your knowledge of cell references will be tested here. First argument, data field. It requires no change. Pivot table is locked to A3, no change required. Next is field 1, title, no change required. Next is item 1, which needs to be replaced. Item 1 is asset. Press F4 to lock the cell reference. Next is field 2, account, no change required. And item 2 is current asset. Press F4 thrice to lock the column reference. Next is field 3, month, no change required. And item 3 is January, which Excel converted into month number. Press F4 to lock the cell reference. Next is field 4, years, no change required. And item 4 is 2022. Press F4 twice to lock the row reference and enter. Copy and paste the formulas. Let's see if it works. Cool. Copy the formula to the liabilities section and replace the cell reference for item 1. I'll sum the totals and calculate the change. Current year minus previous year. Please note, for cash flow purposes, right, an increase in liabilities is an inflow and vice versa. On the other hand, an increase in assets is an outflow, okay? Accountants or financial analysts will find that useful. Now this report works perfectly. So load to a pivot table, accounts to rows and balance to values. So current assets equals this. And you can see that the GETPIVOTDATA formula works exactly like the regular pivot table. So apply the same steps we discussed earlier in creating your dynamic report. Simply replace the hard-coded name with the cell reference, and that's it. The first step is to load the table into the data model. Go to the Power Pivot tab and click Add to Data Model. Now add a quick measure. AutoSum the balance. I'll change the name to balance with a $sign and format the numbers. You can insert a pivot table from the data model, but let's exit this view and insert from the workbook, okay? Alt NVD to insert a pivot table from the data model. Now move account to rows and balance to values. Current assets is equal to this. Now press F2 for edit mode. The arguments remain the same. Data field, pivot table, field, and item as a pair. Let's take a closer look. The first argument is the data field. Notice the difference between GETPIVOTDATA for the regular pivot table and the one for the data model. GETPIVOTDATA for pivot tables created from the data model have measures in their data field argument in addition to the name of the measure, wrapped in square bracket. Now the second argument is the pivot table, which remains the same as the regular pivot table, and that's in cell A3. And the third argument is a pair containing the field and item. Notice the difference again. Field 1 is a combination of the table name and field wrapped in square brackets. This is a fully qualified reference where the table name precedes the column name. And item 1 is a combination of the table name, field, and item. An ampersand is used to join the item to the fully qualified reference. Now, if your style is to use Shift and F3 to view and edit the arguments, feel free to do so. Now, to make this formula return the balance for the account selected, all you have to do is replace the hard-coded name with the cell reference. However, you have to join the cell reference to the square brackets with an ampersand on both sides, all wrapped in quotation marks. I'll demonstrate so that I don't confuse you. Start with an opening quotation mark, an ampersand, the cell reference, an ampersand, and a closing quotation mark, and press enter. Copy down. It is now a relative cell reference. If you have multiple fields or items in the pivot table, apply the same steps, okay? Now let's build the report. Now move dates to columns and title to rows. I'll group the date into months and year. I need only month and year in rows. I copied the template from the previous example. To extract the balance of current assets for the month of January, I'll make this cell equal to January 2022 in the pivot table. The formula is really long, so I'll press Alt and Enter to split it into two lines, okay? First argument, data field requires no change. The next is pivot table, which is locked to cell A3. No change is required as well. Next is field 1, account. No change required. And item 1 is current asset. So start with an opening quotation mark, an ampersand, the cell reference. Now press F4 thrice to lock the column reference, an ampersand, a closing quotation mark. Next is field 2, month. No change required. And item 2 is January. Opening quotation mark, an ampersand, the cell reference. Press F4 to lock the cell reference, an ampersand, and a closing quotation. Next is field 3, year. No change required. And item 3 is 2022. Opening quotation mark, an ampersand, the cell reference. Press F4 twice to lock the row reference, an ampersand, a closing quotation mark. I'm sure you're getting a hang of it. Lastly is field 4, title. No change required. And item 4, assets, needs to be replaced. So opening quotation mark, an ampersand, the cell reference. Press F4 to lock, an ampersand, a closing quotation mark. Now press Enter. Cool. Copy and paste the formulas. Let's see if it works. Cool. Now copy the formula to the liabilities section and replace the cell reference for item 4. Now this report works perfectly. When your table is loaded into the data model, it can be converted into formulas, which gives you the flexibility of creating custom reports from a pivot table. Now the first step is to insert a pivot table from the data model, Alt NVD. Next, arrange the pivot table in your preferred format before converting to formulas. In this case, the goal is to calculate the movement in assets and liabilities over 2 periods. So move title and account to rows and year to columns, and balance to values. In the Design tab, add subtotals and remove grand totals. I'll turn off the field headers in the Analyze tab to make the table less busy. Align the numbers to the right. Now add a slicer for month. Right click and add as slicer. Go to the Slicer tab and make the number of columns 6. I'll edit the caption to month and adjust the size accordingly. We can now convert to formulas. In the Analyze tab, Calculations group, click OLAP Tools and select Convert to Formulas. The pivot table have now been converted into cube formulas. Press F2 to view and remain connected to the slicer, which you can filter by month. Now add a column to calculate the change. 2022 is the current year and 2021 is last year. So that's current year minus last year. Now copy down. You can format the table so it looks nice. And now we have a dynamic report. Isn't this cool? To wrap up, we discussed how to edit GetPivotData and create a dynamic report from a regular pivot table, which works the same way as a pivot table loaded directly from Power Query. We also looked at a pivot table from the data model and a pivot table converted to cube formulas. I hope you found the tutorial useful. Please leave your comments, feedback, and questions below, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Please subscribe if you haven't, and don't forget to click the like button. Thank you.